I would be the first to admit that of all the podcasts I've done on the Thomas Take Sports podcast, I am least looking forward to this one because I think it's well known that I have a heavy respect for mixed martial artists. I have a heavy amount of respect for boxers. I have a heavy amount of respect for amateur wrestlers. I have a heavy amount of respect for those that compete in the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu circuit. I have a respect for anyone that is willing to step in there and go up against another man or go up against another woman in a combat sports arena or realm, I guess you could say. In a combat sports arena, I guess you could say as well. And for me to dive into the career, the past, the present, the future of B.J. Penn, the only way I have to do that is really go back to the beginning and to put things in perspective for each and every MMA fan out there, whether they are a past, present, or eventual future fan, because there's no denying it. You will become a fan of the sport of mixed martial arts. It might take you some time. It might be one fighter that makes you decide to come along to the sport of MMA, like Kyle Hughes told me yesterday on the podcast that Conor McGregor was that guy for him, that George St. Pierre was for me, that Randy Couture was for fight fans, that Chuck Liddell was for fight fans, that Hoist Gracie and Ken Shamrock were for fight fans. And like B.J. Penn was for so many fight fans, he was that guy that helped galvanize all the talent in the world, harness it, channel it into one entity, and just go full speed ahead, full steam ahead, as B.J. Penn won both the UFC welterweight titles and the UFC lightweight title, the first fighter to win two titles in two different weight classes below light heavyweight, the first lighter weight fighter to really be a true legend within this sport of mixed martial arts. And for as many legends as there have been, B.J. Penn was the first. So to really put things in perspective, it says a lot that this guy was the first legend of a lighter weight class inside the sport of mixed martial arts, whether it was 170, whether it was 155. B.J. Penn defied the odds so many times. And for as great a fighter as George St. Pierre was, being the greatest fighter of all time, in my opinion, the closest George St. Pierre ever came to losing outside of the two instances where he did get armbarred versus Matt Hughes, and he did get knocked out by Matt Serra. There was a split decision fight between B.J. Penn and George St. Pierre. The winner eventually went on to fight Matt Hughes, which was George St. Pierre, which helped George St. Pierre reclaim that UFC welterweight title the first time. That fight really set apart both Penn and St. Pierre as the two best fighters of their era. And it was a split decision fight. It was a hotly contested fight. Those that you ask 10 people, 5 would say Penn won, 5 would say GSP won. So that says a lot. That puts in perspective. B.J. Penn was one of the 3 guys that gave the greatest fighter, in my opinion, of all time, his toughest night at the office. His toughest night. And now you fast forward, it's 2019. And the fighters of yesteryear that B.J. Penn had his shining moments against, whether it was Matt Hughes, whether it was George St. Pierre, those guys are retired. And B.J. Penn is still fighting. Whether it was Matt Serra, whether it was Sean Shirk, whether it was Joe Daddy Stevenson, whether it was Kenny Florian, you get the point here. The majority of the guys that B.J. Penn fought in his era, in his day, are gone, are retired, are removed completely from the sport. And here we are, it's 2019, and the once great B.J. Penn is 40 years old. He has set a UFC record, the most consecutive losses in UFC history. And I've talked about this, I've touched on this, a little bit. And I didn't really want to dive into it a whole lot because I feel like it's just not right to kick a man while he's down. But for the sake of the podcast and for the sake of the fact that people really want to know my opinion on this, I believe that both B.J. Penn and Dana White owe the world an explanation as to why they are continuing to allow this to happen. B.J. Penn obviously wants to fight. He's the fighter. He's going to want to fight. But it's up to Dana White as the promoter to not allow him to do so. And the fact that Dana White is allowing this to happen, as I said on the Thomas Take Sports Podcast Facebook page, is nothing short of disgusting, is nothing short of despicable, and there is simply no reason as to why B.J. Penn is fighting anymore. No reason at all. And to go back, B.J. Penn has won 1 of his last 11 fights, and his last win was in November of 2010, where he knocked out the long-retired Matt Hughes. Fought John Fitch to a draw, fought Nick Diaz to a unanimous decision loss, fought Rory McDonald to a loss, Frankie Edgar to a TKO defeat, Yair Rodriguez to a TKO defeat after a 3-year layoff, Dennis Seaver after a few months later, Dennis Seaver, a loss, a majority decision. Ryan Hall, a submission heel hook, which Ryan Hall is notoriously known for that heel hook submission, and B.J. Penn got caught in it. And last but surely not least, Clay the Carpenter Guida, which Clay Guida, no offense to Clay Guida, but he's pretty basic as far as the style that he brings to the table, and he unanimously defeated B.J. Penn. B.J. Penn's pro MMA record within 32 matches, 32 fights, is 16 wins and 14 losses, being that he has won, count them, or lost 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 straight fights, and now he is fighting Nick Lentz, scheduled to fight Nick Lentz sometime in the fall, probably September, probably October. And it really makes you wonder, why is this happening? B.J. Penn has accomplished anything and everything in this sport. He's done it all. He's fought the best. He's beat the best of his era. Longtime reigning defending champion. At one point, he was one of the best fighters pound for pound on planet Earth. At one point, he was the number 1 pound for pound fighter on planet Earth. What more is there to prove? But much like football players that stick around too long, much like boxers that stick around too long, much like any sports athlete that just sticks around too long, the one common denominator of all of it is that said athlete really wants to be around for the cheers, wants to be around for the crowd, wants to revel in the moment, take it all in. They cannot walk away from that. They cannot walk away from that dynamic of their career. And I think that is one small part of it with B.J. Penn. But there's a very disturbing trend that is taking place with B.J. Penn outside the octagon. B.J. Penn outside the octagon has found himself in some trouble. He's had some bar fights. He's had some domestic violence allegations and some rumors of him with some potential drug use. These are things that are not conducive to a fighter's career, whether these are accusations that are truthful, whether these are accusations that are false. The fact that all this stuff is going on in the life of B.J. Penn, and yet he is continuously fighting, I think that's terrible. Whether the allegations are true or not, the fact that B.J. Penn is fighting still with all this stuff going on, I can't help but wonder, is this a massive distraction for B.J. Penn? You can't help but wonder that. Whether he's 40 years old or not, 40 years old on top of the drama of his life personally that is toppled on top of that fact that he's 40 years old and not the fighter that he once was, I think lends itself to the argument that, yes, B.J. Penn has no business being in that octagon because of the fact that he is just not in the right frame of mind. I'm worried about B.J. Penn. I do not want to hear the story of B.J. Penn going down this dark, path, that of a Junior Seau, that of a Dave Dearson, that of a, those are the two examples that I can really think of, but you get the point. I don't want to see B.J. Penn go down this dark path, and I fear that could be a distinct possibility within this facet, this dynamic of his career, within this time period of his career. And with a loss, B.J. Penn would be 16-15. No one ever thought that B.J. Penn's record would be one win above 500. If someone told me that, 10 years ago, 9 years ago, when B.J. Penn knocked out Matt Hughes, I would have said you were crazy. But the more I think about it, I would say to myself, well, there's one thing that B.J. Penn loves to do. There's one thing that B.J. Penn has always loved to do, and that's fight. And that's what he's doing. He's fighting. He's not winning. He's losing. But most of all, he is fighting. He is stepping in there. And for Dana White to continue to let this happen, to continue to give B.J. Penn fights, I think it's a real shame. I think it's a real stain on his legacy as a fighter. Can anyone take away the fact that he did win the UFC welterweight and UFC lightweight titles? No. No one can change those moments in history. They're some of the greatest moments in the history of the sport. But then knowing what the timeline will eventually pass with, the history of his career, it's a shame. He is tarnishing his legacy. There is no doubt about it. And worse than that, Dana White is allowing it to happen. And I can only wonder if Dana White is allowing this stuff to happen because B.J. Penn, not so long ago, but really not long ago, if you're a hardcore fan, you would know this as well as I do. B.J. Penn put the UFC through a rigorous contract negotiation period where he demanded more money, wanted more money as the welterweight champ, didn't get it, went over to Japan, went over and traveled around the world, and ultimately fought Lyoto Machida at 197 or 202 or some weird catch weight fight, 181 or something weird, 191, something weird, where BJ Penn, the former UFC welterweight, former UFC lightweight champ, and actually fought at featherweight as of recently, fought the former UFC light heavyweight champ at 205 pounds in Lyoto Machida, former number one middleweight contender in Lyoto Machida. And that says quite a lot right there for everyone that is wondering. BJ Penn was, is, and always will be one of the baddest SOBs on the planet. But this new opponent for BJ, Nick Lentz, had a lot to say today on the Area Hawani MMA show. And I had to take notice. I had to watch it. I had to watch it in its entirety. He believes, and quote, that he is the only man that has ever cared about B.J. Penn, the only man that has ever been willing to state the facts about B.J. and where B.J. has gone wrong throughout his life and throughout his career. And guys, I hate to say this, but I have to wonder if some of these rumors that we're hearing about B.J. Penn are true. We know it's true. We know that he did get into a fight with a bouncer outside of a Hawaii nightclub, and we know that times are very strenuous for him in his marriage with his wife. She filed reports that he was domestically abusive to her for over 10 years and was a negligent father and a lot of things that you hate to hear about anybody, let alone about somebody that you've admired, somebody that you had posters of them on your wall as a kid growing up as an MMA fan. These are the things that I do not want to hear or read about B.J. Penn. I want to hear about B.J. Penn being a hero to his people of Hawaii, being a ambassador for the sport, and being somebody that is willing to walk away when it is time. And apparently, this is his last fight in the UFC, per Dana White. If B.J. Penn, dare I say it, wants to continue fighting after this and wants to fight in another organization, Dana White said, I can't control what he does outside of the UFC, and he can't. So who's to say that this is B.J. Penn's last fight? It's his last fight in the UFC, maybe not so much in MMA, and I would really hate to see B.J. Penn go down this dark path of just losing fight after fight after fight and retire from this sport with a 16-28 record. No one wants to see that. And I think that that's the direction that we've already gone down, And really, I think this takes on a bigger meaning, and I think the opportunity right now is a great one, because for B.J. Penn to fight this upcoming fight in the next couple months as a 40-year-old man that has really taken more strikes, I believe, than any UFC fighter ever has. He's been through more wars, has been through a lot of battles. You have to wonder if he's taking on this fight. You have to wonder if his mental health is not there, but you have to wonder what his health will be like in general, physically, within the next 5 years. Will he have CTE? Does he already have CTE? What will the direction of his life, flow towards beyond his fighting career? And I couldn't give you that answer. I'm sure he would be welcomed with open arms in a broadcast booth of some sort, or working as a promoter or something like that, generating a MMA promotion within the state of Hawaii, which would be massive, and he would be the only guy that could really pull it off, because Hawaii doesn't really have a lot of MMA events there, but they've created two phenomenal fighters, B.J. Penn and Max Holloway. So, sorry about that, Travis Brown, but it just is what it is. And that's what I think B.J. Penn's legacy should be, but instead it has turned into this dark, deep, troubling legacy that is just heading down a really bad path, and the last thing MMA wants to see is a Chris Benoit situation or a Tommy Morrison situation, where these two guys that were the up-and-comers or big names in their sport decided to just go down a wrong path and really neglect those around him and neglect those around them, meaning that their families and their friends and those that really care. And B.J. Penn has one of the biggest fan bases ever. And to think of how those fans would react if they heard something about their Hawaiian MMA hero, it does sadden me. And the news of this really saddened me. The news of this really struck a chord, because the bigger conversation is the fact that boxing had a death with a fighter that was 28 years old, undefeated. He died in the hospital, half hour after the fight. And now we're talking about B.J. Penn fighting at the age of 40, coming off of 7 straight losses. What are we talking about, guys? Why are we even being put in this position as media or as fans? Why are we being put in a position to talk about this like this? It's not right. It's simply not right. I wish B.J. Penn all the luck in the world. I really do. God bless him, because I think he's going through a lot right now, personally and professionally. Does not know what his next step is, but I will say this. I'll be rooting for him, and I hope his career ends on a great note. I'm Ryan Thomas. That was the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. You can tune into that on Spotify as well as Apple Podcasts. Subscribe, and follow on Spotify. Take care.